Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter. This is your time to drift. And tonight, we're going to wander into a question that sounds simple, but manages to stir up about 200 years of arguments, experiments, and, of course, scientists dramatically declaring that everyone else is wrong. The question is, can plants think? Now, I know what you're thinking, or at least what I would be thinking if I wasn't busy trying to fall asleep. Plants don't have brains. They don't have little leafy skulls hiding tiny green neurons. No one has ever cracked open a sunflower and found a miniature cerebellum in there, spinning with plant thoughts like, I hate this soil, or the bee was cute, but I'm playing hard to get. But, and here's where things get mildly inconvenient, plants do a whole lot of things that look suspiciously like decision-making. They sense, they communicate, they remember, and sometimes they even hold grudges. Which means we are stuck in that weird twilight zone where scientists can't quite agree on how to label all this. Is it thinking? Or is it just glorified chemical gossip? So tonight, we'll float slowly through this leafy mess. No rush. We'll meet some of the weird characters in the history of plant intelligence, the philosophers who thought beans were basically people, the Victorians who wired plants up like steampunk lie detectors, and the modern researchers who now strap electrodes onto pea shoots like they're prepping them for a sci-fi audition. And of course, we'll keep it chill, because if there's one thing plants are good at, it's moving very, very slowly, which is exactly the pace we want when we're trying to fall asleep. Let's start with something ancient, because history always makes things sound a little more important than they actually were. Back in ancient Greece, there were a few philosophers, some famous, some you've never heard of and probably never need to, who insisted that plants had souls. Not in the Disney way, where the oak tree starts singing about friendship, but in a slightly boring hierarchy of life kind of way. Aristotle, always ready with a system, decided that plants had what he called a vegetative soul. This was the most basic bottom-shelf soul you could get, the clearance rack of souls. According to him, the vegetative soul gave plants the ability to grow, reproduce, and suck up nutrients. But that was it. None of the premium upgrades like movement, sensation, or heaven forbid, consciousness. In other words, plants were basically biological vending machines. Put in sunlight, water, and soil, and out comes more plant. A very tidy view. And it stuck around for centuries, because people like Aristotle have a habit of being quoted long after they should have been politely ignored. But not everyone was on board with this minimalist model. The Pythagoreans, for example, the folks famous for triangles and cult-like diets, were convinced plants were conscious. They even believed eating beans was borderline cannibalism, which is one of those historical facts you really don't need but can't unlearn once it's in your brain. Imagine sitting at dinner with a Pythagorean. You stab a fork into your lentil stew and suddenly they're gasping like you've just murdered a cousin. Now, fast forward a couple thousand years and the debate is still raging, but with better equipment and more Latin words. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists were poking, prodding, and occasionally electrifying plants just to see what would happen. Spoiler, a lot happened. Take Charles Darwin. Yes, the guy with the beard who ruined family gatherings by suggesting that humans and apes are basically cousins. In his later years, Darwin became absolutely obsessed with plants. You could even say plants were his retirement hobby, except instead of knitting or fishing, he was conducting slightly disturbing experiments in his greenhouse. Darwin suspected that plant roots were how do I put this gently, smarter than anyone was giving them credit for. He noticed that the tip of a root behaved almost like a brain. It could sense obstacles, moisture, gravity, and then somehow tell the rest of the root what to do. In his typically understated style, Darwin said it was as if the root tip had a brain in it, which was the Victorian equivalent of saying, "Guys, I think plants might be secretly plotting something." Of course, Darwin didn't mean literal brains, but his comment was juicy enough to stick, and later scientists ran with it. Some of them a little too far. One of my personal favorites is Jagadish Chandra Bose, an Indian physicist and biologist from the late 1800s who basically decided that plants were dramatic little divas. He built a contraption called a crescograph, which magnified plant movements thousands of times so you could actually watch them reacting in real time. Bose then proceeded to torture plants for science. He poked them, burned them, gave them chloroform, because apparently even plants weren't safe from Victorian experimental overenthusiasm. And the plants, to his delight, reacted. They flinched, slowed down, or in some cases outright collapsed like Victorian ladies at a hot opera. Bose concluded that plants had something like a nervous system, and that they were definitely capable of feeling pain. Cue the outrage. Western scientists, of course, were like, "Excuse me, sir, are you suggesting my salad is screaming at me?" But Bose stood firm, pointing to his graphs and wiggly plant lines as proof that we weren't as unique as we like to think. Was he right? Well, sort of. Modern science says plants don't have nerves, so they can't feel pain in the way animals do, but they do send electrical signals, and they do respond to injury, which makes this one of those awkward situations where Bose was wrong in the details, but right in the vibes. Speaking of vibes, let's slide into the 1970s, a weird decade where everyone was experimenting with polyester, disco, and apparently plant polygraphs. This brings us to Cleve Baxter, a lie detector expert who one day decided to hook his office Dracaena up to a polygraph machine, because why not? Apparently paperwork was slow that day. To his utter shock, the plant's graph jumped dramatically when he thought about burning one of its leaves. Not when he actually burned it, but when he merely thought about it. Baxter immediately concluded that plants were psychic. They could read human intentions, feel our emotions, and probably judge us for every overwatered pothos in existence. He called it primary perception, which sounds very serious but was mostly laughed out of mainstream science. But here's the twist. His experiments got wildly popular with the general public. Suddenly, people everywhere were talking to their houseplants, playing them Mozart, and wondering if their ficus secretly knew all their darkest secrets. Plant telepathy became a cultural fad, nestled somewhere between crystal healing and pyramid power. And while the scientific community wasn't impressed, the idea stuck in popular imagination. Maybe, just maybe, your cactus was watching you back. Now, I don't want to get your hopes up. If you are imagining a literal secret life of plants, where they gossip behind your back and plan revolutions while you sleep, well, sorry. The truth is quieter, slower, and much less cinematic. What modern science actually shows us is that plants are masters of chemical communication. They don't chat with neurons, but they do send tiny chemical text messages through the air and soil. For example, when a caterpillar munches on a leaf, the plant doesn't just sulk in silence. It releases volatile compounds that float into the air. Some of these chemicals make the leaf taste nasty, basically telling the caterpillar, "Enjoy your bitter disappointment." Others drift out and attract predators like wasps, who swoop in to eat the caterpillar, which honestly is pretty gangster for a plant. Plants also warn their neighbors. If one acacia tree gets attacked, it can release chemicals that nearby acacias pick up, and suddenly everyone in the grove is pumping out toxins. It's like an organic version of a group chat. Heads up, guys, incoming giraffe. Do plants know they're doing this? Probably not in the way we'd call knowledge, but it looks like a lot of cooperation, and it raises the annoying possibility that consciousness might not be the neat on-off switch we like to imagine. And this, dear sleepy listener, is where we'll float toward next, the uncomfortable philosophical swamp of definitions. Part 2. Can plants think? Memory, light, and leafy lessons. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations or condolences. Either way, let's pick up the thread and keep moving slowly, like ivy finding its way along a fence post. Last time we left off with the big question of what thinking even means. Tonight, or rather, this next stretch of the night, we'll zoom in on a few very specific things plants do that look alarmingly brain-adjacent. We'll talk about memory, we'll talk about how they use light like a kind of language, and we'll gently poke around the scientists who try to measure all this while pretending their bean sprouts aren't silently judging them. So, yeah, settle back down. Maybe roll over to the other side of the pillow, and let's see what these green things are really up to. Let's start with memory. Not the kind where you lie in bed at 2 a.m. remembering something embarrassing from middle school. That one's all yours. Plant memory is different. It's quiet, practical, and weirdly effective. One of the most famous experiments here involves a plant called Mimosa pudica. If you don't know it, picture a fern that hates being touched. The moment you poke its leaves, they snap shut, folding up like a shy child hiding their face. It's adorable, if a little dramatic. Back in the 1970s, a researcher named Monica Gagliano, yes, the same scientist who later compared plants to jazz musicians, which we'll get to, decided to test whether mimosa could learn. She dropped potted plants from a small height over and over again to startle them. At first, the plants closed up in alarm. Perfectly reasonable. If you were a fern, you'd also freak out if someone kept shoving you off a ledge. But here's the twist. After a while, the plants stopped reacting. They realized, or at least chemically deduced, that the drop wasn't actually dangerous. And weeks later, they still remembered this. When tested again, they ignored the harmless drop, staying calm and open, like leafy little Zen masters. Was that memory? Was it learning? Gagliano thought so. She argued that plants could store information from the past and change their behavior accordingly, which is basically the definition of memory, even if it's happening without neurons. Of course, other scientists were horrified, because if plants can remember, then our human exclusivity club suddenly gets a lot less exclusive. But honestly, isn't that kind of what science does? Every decade or so, it rips away another thing we thought made us special. First, we weren't the center of the universe. Then, we weren't separate from animals. Now, we're not even the only things that sort of remember. It's enough to make you want to join the plants and just stop reacting altogether. But memory is just one piece of the puzzle. Another big one is how plants handle light, not just for photosynthesis, but for information. Light is basically plant Wi-Fi. Take sunflowers. They don't just sit there and soak up rays. They track the sun across the sky, moving their heads like very slow, very committed paparazzi. In the morning, they face east. By evening, they're westward, and at night, they reset, ready for the next performance. This tracking isn't just passive, it's guided by internal clocks, hormone signals, and feedback loops, which means the plant is integrating time, direction, and energy availability into one big leafy decision. Sounds suspiciously brain-ish. And then there's photoperiodism, a fancy word for plants know how long the day is. Some flowers only bloom when the nights are long enough. Others refuse unless the nights are short, which basically makes them natural chronologists, keeping better track of seasons than most of us keep track of birthdays. Imagine if you didn't own a calendar, but your entire body could still tell you exactly when to schedule your vacation. Plants do that all the time, and they don't even complain about flight delays. Let's drift over to communication again, because this is where things start sounding less like boring botany and more like vegetable conspiracy. We already touched on chemical group chats, where one tree warns the others about hungry giraffes. But it goes deeper. Some plants actually manipulate other species. Orchids, for example, release chemicals that mimic the pheromones of male insects. The male insects, bless them, come buzzing over expecting romance, only to get tricked into pollinating the flower. It's not exactly consensual, but it is effective. Then there are parasitic plants like dodder. Dodder looks like spaghetti that decided to live its best life. It snakes around, searching for a host. But it doesn't just latch on to anything. It can literally smell the chemical profile of nearby plants and decide which one will make the tastiest victim. Then it grows toward that one, wraps it up, and starts siphoning off nutrients. If that's not decision-making, it's at least decision-adjacent, a kind of leafy opportunism. Dodder may not know it's being selfish, but selfishness happens all the same. Now, I know what you're wondering, or maybe you're not, since hopefully you're getting drowsy. But if you are awake, does all this mean plants have consciousness? Here's the official scientific answer. Absolutely not. Stop asking. Please go away. And here's the unofficial whispered in the hallways answer. Well, maybe. It depends how you define it. Some researchers argue for what they call plant neurobiology. Yes, they actually use that phrase, even though it drives traditional neuroscientists absolutely bananas. Plant neurobiologists point out that plants have electrical signals, synapse-like structures, and complex chemical networks that look eerily similar to animal brains. They suggest we might be looking at an alternative form of intelligence, distributed, slow, and chemical instead of centralized and electrical. Critics, meanwhile, roll their eyes so hard they risk permanent injury. To them, calling it neurobiology is misleading, even dangerous. It makes people think lettuce can take the SATs. They prefer boring phrases like signal transduction pathways, which may be accurate but are guaranteed to kill the mood at dinner parties. So the debate continues, and plants, as usual, stay silent, which is probably the wisest move of all. Let's slip sideways for a moment into mythology, because humans have always projected weird personalities onto plants. Take the Greeks again. They loved turning people into plants for punishment, which is honestly not a great review of their creativity. Someone offends a god, boom, now you're a laurel tree. Someone else looks too attractive, bam, narcissus flower. It's basically the mythological version of touch grass. In some cultures, though, plants were seen as wise teachers. Indigenous stories often describe trees and herbs as holding knowledge, guiding people toward medicine or ritual. And while modern science might dismiss that as metaphor, it lines up neatly with what we now know. Plants do hold chemical solutions we barely understand. They can cure, poison, calm, or awaken, which in its own way is a kind of intelligence, just not the human variety. Speaking of medicine, let's float toward caffeine. Yes, the thing currently keeping me from falling asleep while writing this. Plants invented caffeine as a weapon. Coffee plants, tea plants, cacao, all of them produce caffeine to poison insects and suppress competing plants in the soil. And yet somehow, humans came along and said, yes, this feels great. Let's drink it every morning until our nervous systems vibrate. So while plants may not think like us, they certainly manipulate us. We cultivate them, spread their seeds across the world, and devote entire economies to them. If that's not some sneaky long game, I don't know what is. At this point, let's pause and look at the big picture. Plants don't have brains, they don't have nerves, but they sense their environment, process signals, remember past events, communicate with others, and sometimes manipulate animals, including us, for their own survival. If a robot did all that, we'd call it intelligent. But because it's green and leafy, we hesitate. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Intelligence isn't a single thing. It's a spectrum, a messy toolbox of tricks for staying alive.
Part 3. Can plants think? Do plants have feelings, or is that just us? Hey again. If you're still hanging in there, wide awake, that probably wasn't the plan. But don't worry, plants don't rush. They take their time. And so will we. Tonight, we're floating into the world of plant emotions. Now, to be clear, scientists generally hate that phrase. The moment you say plants have feelings, half the biologists in the room immediately start polishing their glasses in exasperation. Because technically, feelings require a nervous system, hormones, neurotransmitters, and of course, the ultimate prestige organ, the brain. Plants don't have those, which in the strict sense means no feelings. But humans are terrible at leaving things alone. We can't resist projecting our moods onto anything that stands still long enough. Dogs, cats, stuffed animals, cars, and yes, plants. Give us a houseplant and 2 weeks of boredom, and suddenly we're convinced it's shy, depressed, or holding a personal grudge. So let's wander slowly through the messy intersection of botany, psychology, and human imagination, where plants become moody characters in our stories, and sometimes where science accidentally encourages the fantasy. Let's rewind to the Victorians again, because they basically invented the idea of plants as emotional creatures. This was the same society that treated ferns like rock stars. People collected them, displayed them in glass cases, and even printed fern patterns on their wallpaper. If you think I'm exaggerating, just know the fad had an actual name, pteridomania, or fern madness, which sounds like something you'd catch on a long hike. Alongside this obsession, Victorians developed a whole language of flowers, floriography, where every bloom meant something. A red rose whispered passion. A lily murmured purity. A yellow carnation hissed disdain, which is honestly kind of harsh for a flower. It was less science and more emotional code, but it set the stage. Plants weren't just green decorations. They were characters with moods and messages. And once you start seeing plants as characters, it's a short hop to wondering if they actually feel. Of course, then came the experiments, because nothing says romanticize nature quite like strapping electrodes to it. We already talked about Jagadish Chandra Bose, the scientist who swore plants responded like sensitive little drama queens when poked or poisoned. His graphs showed electrical wiggles whenever he stressed them out, and while modern researchers would clarify that those wiggles aren't feelings, Bose himself wasn't shy. He wrote about plants with the kind of language you'd usually reserve for fainting aristocrats. Then, of course, Cleve Baxter showed up with his plant polygraph in the 1970s, declaring that his Dracaena could sense his murderous thoughts. Not only that, but according to him, plants could also detect when shrimp were being boiled alive in another room. Which, I don't know how to break it to him, but that's more of a horror novel than a scientific finding. The point is, people really want plants to feel, and every time someone dangles a shred of data in front of us, an electrical spike, a sudden movement, we leap to the conclusion that the plant is scared, sad, or possibly plotting revenge. Now, here's where things get trickier, because while plants don't feel emotions like we do, they do respond in ways that look emotional. Take stress, for instance. In animals, stress floods the body with hormones like cortisol. In plants, stress sparks waves of chemicals like jasmonic acid, abscisic acid, or ethylene. These compounds race through the plant, triggering defenses, close the stomata, thicken the leaves, release toxins. It's not anxiety, but it's stress management, leafy style. Or look at what happens when plants are deprived of water. They send out electrical signals that travel through their tissues, coordinating responses to drought. Some researchers have even recorded these as tiny clicking noises, inaudible to us, but detectable with sensors. So yes, thirsty plants cry out, not in sorrow, but in ultrasound. And if you're wondering, does playing sad violin music help them? The answer is still no, but people keep trying. Which brings us to plant music, another rabbit hole of human projection. There's a long-standing myth that talking to plants helps them grow. Some swear by it. My ficus thrives when I tell it my secrets. Others play classical music to their orchids, convinced Mozart makes them bloom. The scientific verdict? Mixed, but mostly unimpressed. Some studies show sound vibrations can slightly influence growth. Others show no effect at all. What's more likely is that when you talk to your plants, you also water them more, check their soil, and maybe wipe the dust off their leaves. In other words, it's not your dulcet tones, it's your actual care. But hey, if humming to your monstera makes you happy, the plant probably won't complain. Let's pause here and drift into a little thought experiment. Imagine you're a tree, a big oak, sitting in a forest. For 200 years, you've watched seasons come and go. You've battled storms, droughts, woodpeckers, and the occasional squirrel rave. Now, if someone asked whether you felt joy or felt sadness, you'd probably just rustle your leaves in confusion. But you'd also have a library of chemical memories, years of drought stored in your rings, scars from past insect attacks, signals exchanged with fungi beneath your roots. It's not emotion as we know it, but it's still experience. Maybe that's where humans trip up. We assume emotions must look like ours, dramatic, narrative, full of tearful monologues. Plants remind us that there are quieter ways of being. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scientists argue that using words like feelings or emotions for plants is actively harmful. It confuses the public and distracts from real plant biology. If people think lettuce is sad, they might stop taking science seriously. Others counter that metaphors are powerful. Talking about plant feelings helps non-scientists connect with nature. And given the state of the planet, maybe that's more important than technical accuracy. If calling a willow tree sorrowful makes someone protect it, is that really so bad? So the debate continues, cold accuracy versus poetic empathy. And as usual, the plants remain silent, swaying gently in the breeze, probably wondering why humans can't just chill. Speaking of empathy, let's float into a darker corner, the ethics of eating plants. If plants can sense, remember, and respond, should we feel guilty about eating them? Do carrots scream in chemical agony as we chop them into soup?
The scientific answer is no, not in the way animals suffer. Plants don't have pain receptors or consciousness or the kind of subjective experience that makes suffering suffering. They respond, but they don't feel. But the thought experiment still nags at people. Philosophers have written essays about the moral status of plants. Some vegetarians even use the possibility of plant pain to argue against veganism, because if lettuce hurts, then what's the point of avoiding steak? Personally, I think the lettuce is fine. But again, that's just me and my lunch. At this point, let's pull back and notice a theme. Plants reflect us, not because they think like us, but because we can't stop projecting onto them. We see drooping leaves and call them sad. We see thorns and call them defensive. We see blossoms and call them joyful. Really, they're just doing their plant thing, managing water, repelling pests, chasing sunlight. The feelings are ours. The metaphors are ours. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's even useful. Because those metaphors remind us that life comes in more forms than we usually admit. And when you're lying in bed trying to drift off, it's kind of soothing to imagine that the tree outside your window has been patiently, wordlessly being itself for decades. No drama, no monologues, just slow, steady persistence. All right, that feels like enough for this stretch. We've wandered through plant feelings, the myths we attach to them, and the blurry line between science and metaphor. In the next part, we'll sink underground into the world of roots, fungi, and the so-called wood wide web, a place where plants might just gossip more than teenagers with free Wi-Fi. So for now, exhale. Imagine leaves folding gently for the night, and let yourself drift just as slowly, just as gently. Part 4. Plant Gossip Networks. So here's a fun question. When a plant gets eaten by a caterpillar, is it just sitting there like, well, I guess this is how I go? Or is it, in its own leafy way, calling the neighbors and warning them to get their act together? Turns out, plants gossip. Not in the scandalous who's dating who sense. More like, hey, there's a hungry bug chewing on me, so maybe get bitter before he gets to you? Researchers in the 1980s figured this out with sagebrush. They noticed that when one sagebrush got nibbled on, nearby sagebrushes started pumping out chemical defenses, even if they hadn't been touched yet. So the only logical conclusion was the plants were sending airborne chemical signals. Basically, sagebrush was spilling the tea into the wind. And because science loves a dramatic headline, the papers called this plant communication, which makes sense. I mean, imagine sitting quietly in a forest and suddenly a sagebrush whispers, "Psst, danger." Creepy, but also kind of impressive. But it doesn't stop there. Corn, when attacked by caterpillars, releases chemicals that attract wasps. The wasps, being the ruthless little things they are, swoop in and lay their eggs inside the caterpillars. It's like the corn calling the mafia for backup. Nature can be brutal, but also very efficient. Now, you might think, okay, but that's just chemistry. That doesn't count as thinking. Fair enough. Plants don't sit there making pro and con lists about wasp partnerships. But what they do is remarkably strategic. They send the right signals at the right time, often in ways that benefit the group. That's coordination. That's, dare I say it, teamwork.
let's float over to trees, because, of course, they had to take it one step further. If plants are like introverts whispering across the room, trees are basically running an underground social network through fungi. Yes, fungi, because why not add mushrooms into this story? The roots of trees connect with fungal threads called mycorrhizae. Together, they form what scientists lovingly call the wood wide web. I wish I were joking. That is the real name, and it works exactly how it sounds. Nutrients, signals, even warning messages flow through this fungal internet. So if a tree gets attacked by beetles, it can send a warning through the fungal lines, and neighboring trees, even of different species, might get the memo and toughen up their bark. It's like trees sending out a group text. Hey guys, bugs are here. Good luck. Now, of course, skeptics roll their eyes and say, well, it's just evolution. No one's actually thinking. And sure. But isn't it funny how quickly we give credit to animals for similar behaviors? Birds warning each other, smart. Bees doing dances, brilliant. Plants coordinating across miles of root networks. Suddenly it's, oh, that's just instinct. Maybe we're a little plant-phobic. Maybe we don't like the idea that the oak tree in the park is quietly better at networking than most of us on LinkedIn. But here's where it gets weirder. These underground exchanges aren't always friendly. Some trees hog the network. They take nutrients from others without giving back. Others send out signals that actually sabotage competitors. So yes, even in the plant world, there are freeloaders and saboteurs. Because balance is boring. This is where you might start to wonder, are these choices or just chemistry? Is there a difference? And honestly, that's the question that keeps biologists awake at night. Which, conveniently, is not your problem right now. Because the goal is to fall asleep. Part 5. Do plants have memory? So, here's where it gets suspicious. Plants seem to remember things, not in a Dear Diary kind of way, but in a slow, quiet, I know what happened last time, so I'm not falling for that again kind of way. Back in the 1970s, a researcher named Tony Trevowas started poking at this idea. He wasn't saying plants had brains. He was saying plants might keep a record of experiences and then change their behavior the next time. Which, if we're being honest, is a pretty decent definition of memory. One of the classics in this debate is the Mimosa pudica experiment. That's the sensitive plant. You touch it and its leaves dramatically fold up like it's fainting. Very theatrical, but also very consistent. So scientists did what scientists do. They annoyed it over and over by dropping it a short distance onto foam padding. Annoying, but harmless. At first, the plant curled up dramatically every single time, but after a while, it stopped bothering. It realized the drop wasn't dangerous, and it stayed open, which is basically the plant version of saying, I'm not wasting energy on this again. Even more suspicious, weeks later, when tested again, the plants still remembered. They still refused to close up for the fake threat. That's memory, in a leafy, very quiet way. Now, critics say, that's not memory, that's just desensitization. But what exactly is memory if not learning to react differently after experience? If your brain can call it memory,
Why can't a plant's cells do the same? Let's glide over to sunflowers. They follow the sun during the day, right? That's called heliotropism. But at night, they swing their heads back to the east, ready for sunrise, which means they're anticipating. They remember the cycle. They know the sun will come up. They're not surprised every morning like, oh wow, big glowing ball again. They plan for it. That's a biological clock, but it also feels a lot like habit, routine, and yes, memory. Plants also remember stresses. If a plant goes through a drought, it can adjust how it uses water. Labor, when another drought comes, it's quicker to adapt. It's not shocked by the dry spell, it's ready. That's experience shaping behavior. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Even at the genetic level, plants show memory. It's called epigenetics. Basically, chemical tags get added to DNA after experiences, like post-it notes that say, "Don't forget, last winter was rough." And here's the wild part. Sometimes those tags get passed on to the next generation. So the kids of stressed plants are born already a little wary, as if their parents whispered bedtime warnings through DNA. Now, of course, plants aren't writing memoirs. They're not reminiscing about the good old days when the soil was wetter. But the fact remains, they hold on to information, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. That is, at the very least, memory in its simplest form. But here's the thing, if plants can remember, even a little, can they also forget? Turns out, yes. If conditions return to normal for long enough, some plants lose their stress markers. They relax. They drop the baggage. Maybe plants are better at letting go than we are. So, next time you forget where you put your keys, just remember, somewhere in the rainforest, a tree is out there recalling a drought from 50 years ago. And frankly, that's a little humbling. Let's wander now into another strange corner, the possibility that plants might actually recognize faces. Well, not faces exactly, but identities.